So, Mike, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hans, and good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. Let's jump right into it because we lost some time. So first, moving to the first slide, of course. The event in Texas in February is, it seems like ancient history now to the way some of these discussions go, but it's certainly passed into legend and deserves as much scrutiny as we can give it. One of the sort of foundational framing issues in the event was that it was a very extreme weather event. And one needs to ask, how extreme was it in order to decide how much of it can be explained by that versus how much was the result of other more human causes. How extreme was the weather? The weather was quite extreme by Texas standards and certainly by South Texas standards. There's been a lot of tendency in the public media to look at the February 2011 event in the ERCOT market, which resulted in some amount of service curtailment. But this event was click the slide, Hans. This event was more severe, both in how cold it got and how much longer and more sustained the cold was. Hans, if you could click the slide, please. So as you see there, the consecutive hours in Austin in particular, for instance, were more than twice as many consecutive hours below freezing. So this was a much more severe event than in February of 2011. But click the slide again, Hans. Was it unprecedented? Well, no, it was not unprecedented. If you look at some historical meteorological data for the Texas region, and you can look back to December of 1989, click, Hans, for a comparable event. Before that, you can look to January of 1949, January of 1930, and February of 1895 for events that were comparably severe. So it was not unprecedented. It's perhaps a 1 in 25 or historically 1 in 30 year event. Click, Hans, please. Statistically rare, but it is also worth asking whether it's going to be less rare in the future. And I think most objective observers would say that chances are it will be less rare in the future. So what happened in the wake of this very severe event? And it's worth also noting that this weather event was not restricted to Texas. The severe conditions obtained across the Midwestern region of North America, and there were less severe, but nonetheless very problematic conditions in all of the nearly all of the power systems up and down the Midwest. The consequences were much more severe in Texas and in South Texas, in part because it is the nature of Texas and South Texas within that region that it is less prepared for these sorts of conditions. But there were definitely big problems elsewhere as well. So what happened in Texas? Looking at the resource fleet, there was quite a bit of generation already out of service as a result of, in part of a less severe storm that occurred a little less than a week earlier, and other issues such as generators out on maintenance outages. Leading up to the 14th of February and into the early hours of the 15th. And what you can see here is that the situation went from bad to very, very much worse very quickly over the course of a few hours. So you went from 30 gigawatts of generating resources out of service to 50 gigawatts of generating resources out of service. Effectively, if you're looking at the thermal fleet, nearly 50% of the thermal generation fleet in Texas was out of service within a few hours early in the morning of the 15th, Monday morning, the 15th. A lot of that generation that was out of service was also wind. And again, there was not quite a bit of the wind fleet in West Texas that had been frozen off in the earlier storm and it's still not recovered. But as we'll see, the more important question is not the absolute numbers of generation capacity out of service, but what was the plan? What was ERCOT's plan going into the winter for conditions that for extreme weather conditions? The great majority of what was out of service was gas. Gas fleet went belly up pretty quickly in the morning of early in the morning of the 15th. A lot of coal was out of service, mainly due to coal pile freeze-ups, but also frozen lines at the plants themselves. And one unit at the Comanche Peak nuclear plant, which was one of two nuclear plants in Texas, 4 nuclear power trains. One of the power trains at Comanche Peak went offline early in the morning of the 15th as well. So ERCOT was looking at a very severe situation. Next slide, please. So again, the important question is, what was ERCOT's plan going into the winter, and how well prepared were they for extreme weather conditions? Well, the plan was heavily reliant on the gas generation fleet, and to a lesser extent on coal, to a lesser extent again on nuclear, and to some extent on wind. ERCOT, Texas has a higher penetration of wind generation than any other region in the country, any other system in the country, and one of the highest penetrations of wind generation of any system in the world. 31 gigawatts out of a total peak demand of around 70 to 80 gigawatts. But in the ERCOT winter plan for basic winter conditions, they were relying on only about 7 gigawatts of that 31 gigawatts to be operating, because they have the historical data that indicates that that's the reliable amount of wind that can be available under those conditions. So while there was a lot of wind out of service, it was always assumed going into the winter that there would be a lot of wind out of service, either because it had frozen or because wind conditions are simply typically low during very, very cold winter storms. The plan then accounts for typical outages under those conditions, typical planned enforced outage rates. And as you can see, looking at the normal peak demand during winter of about 58 gigawatts, the plan looked at an extreme case of 67 gigawatts of peak demand. And even with expected outages, the planned resources and the available resources, or the expected available resources, should have been sufficient to get through the event. Now, as it turns out, the estimated peak during the event itself was not 67 gigawatts, but 77 gigawatts. Had the system been dealing with a normal level of outages among its resource fleet, there would have probably been some amount of rolling system curtailments, but it wouldn't have been anything close to the severity of what was actually experienced. And in fact, one can argue, I would argue, that for a 1 in 25 or a 1 in 30 year weather event, a prudent planner would actually expect to have to call to some extent on controlled load curtailments or service interruptions for a small amount of system load for a limited period of time as a way of maintaining system stability. It would not be economically prudent to build supply resources that would only come into play once every 25 or once every 30 years to meet these sorts of conditions. So had everything worked the way it should have, even under the very extreme peak demand conditions that were experienced, ERCOT should have been able to get through this situation with minimal disruption. What actually happened? Next, please. Well, if you look at these, the hashed sections of these columns, huge swaths of what was expected and should have been able to be expected generation was simply out of service, not available. Most of that was gas. About nearly 50% of the gas-fired generating fleet was offline by early morning of the 15th and remained offline for much the next 2 or 3 days. About 40% of the coal fleet went offline. About 20 to 25% of the nuclear fleet went offline. Through the course of the event, on average, about half of the base case expectation for wind generation was available. So the base case expectation was about 7 gigawatts on average, and on average, they were getting about 3 to 4 gigawatts. They actually did have a low wind contingency case of 2 gigawatts, and for most of the event, they exceeded that fairly comfortably, except for a few hours the morning of the evening of the 15th into the morning of the 16th. And then, of course, there are other resources. So what was actually available was about 35 gigawatts below what was needed to meet peak demand. So a huge shortfall of available generating capacity. Again, the vast majority of that being thermal generation. There was the plan was not significantly reliant on wind to get them through an event like this, and so wind had very little to do with it. Next, please. It certainly could have been much worse, as this graph from ERCOT shows. The drop in frequency on the system during those few minutes, terrifying minutes early in the morning of the 15th, was such that that ERCOT came within 4.5 minutes of having to dump the entire ERCOT grid, and it would have taken days, if not weeks, to re-energize the ERCOT system. It was only because of the mandatory load shedding that they were able to keep the lights on. And so the event was a disaster by any metric, but it was not a system-wide blackout. It was a severe controlled load curtailment. Next slide, please. So loss of load was significant, 20 gigawatts at the most extreme. And again, that loss of load was sustained over a period of days, not a period of minutes or hours. So this was an extremely severe event, had enormous consequences for the residents of Texas, some 200 deaths approximately, approximately $100 billion in economic damage. And that extended not just to electricity and gas, but also to water systems, to building structures, et cetera, et cetera. Next, please. There is a very important issue to be looked at regarding the role of not just natural gas fired generation, but natural gas itself in this event. If we look at natural gas production nationally and in the South, the Gulf region, Gulf of Mexico region of North America, you can see that in the course that in the event, natural gas production itself was very severely affected, and in the Gulf of Mexico region, which is labeled here as Texas, as much as 50% of natural gas production was lost as a result of these weather conditions. Next slide, please. More importantly, and this is something that one doesn't hear about very much, the catastrophe in the natural gas sector preceded what what took place in the electricity grid by a matter of days. Gas production in the Gulf region started to drop off precipitously on the 12th, 3 days before the first ERCOT load shed notice. So the claims that this was specifically an electricity disaster, electricity crisis, and are belied by the fact that gas supply had already started to drop off precipitously as a result of freeze-ups at both the wellhead for production, as well as in natural gas processing facilities, as well as at natural gas compressor stations on the pipelines in the Gulf of Mexico region. And while we've heard a lot of talk about the load shed affecting critical natural gas infrastructure facilities. In other words, cutting off electricity to electric drive compressor stations and cutting off electricity to processing facilities and production facilities. And that certainly exacerbated the problem. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But that exacerbated a problem that was already extremely severe before ERCOT ever issued its first load shed notice. Next slide, please. So there are lots of opinions about what actually happened and what needs to be done in the wake of this event. Most of them, unfortunately, are not correct. And this is a typical example. The governor of Texas knew of natural gas shortages days before the blackout, but blamed wind anyway. We saw a lot of that sort of stuff going on, and continue to see a lot of that stuff going on. Next slide, please. So some things that did not happen. Click, please, Hans. As already pointed out, this event was not caused by an over-reliance on wind or a reliance on wind. But it certainly did illustrate the remaining challenge that we face of replacing the role that fossil fuel generation plays in such circumstances. Next, please. There was no shortage of firm capacity. There's been a lot of talk of the Warren Buffett proposal of having the state guarantee the construction of, I don't know, 10 gigawatts of new gas-fired generation. But of course, there was plenty of gas-fired generation. There's plenty of coal-fired generation. There's plenty of nuclear generation. There's plenty of thermal generation available to deal with this event, even given that it was a 25 to 30-year storm. That wasn't the problem. There was a shortage of cross-sectoral planning and, of course, a shortage of fossil gas. Next, please. Market design really had nothing to do with this. Maybe not nothing, but very little to do with this. All markets, including markets with capacity markets, rely heavily on prudent foresight and prudent regulation. And that was lacking from the regulator on down. If we're going to substitute markets for regulated monopoly centralized planning, and we are, and we have, they need two basic things to operate. One is appropriate financial incentives, and the second is the information that market participants need to act on those incentives. And it's instructive to look at two examples, both this event and then look at the polar vortex in the PJM region in 2014, which was a severe winter event that affected the mid-Atlantic and East Central region of the US. And if you look at the PJM event, and PJM, of course, for many of you will know, PJM has a capacity market. The PJM market participants going into the PJM event, because of the nature of that region, the typical meteorological patterns in that region, had all the information they needed to know how frequently they were likely to encounter severe winter conditions. Severe winter conditions are fairly common in that region. But because of the structure of the capacity markets and the way they interact with energy markets at the time, there were not sufficient financial incentives for market participants to make the arrangements needed to ensure that that they were most likely to available when the system most needed them. And so 25% of the thermal generation that was being paid to be firm capacity under the PJM capacity market simply failed to perform during that event. So the information was available, but the financial incentives were not, even though PJM had a capacity market. And that has been remedied since then with the adoption of pay for performance reforms to the capacity market, which make the capacity market function on the basis of scarcity pricing in the same way that an energy-only market does. If you look at Texas in February of this year, the situation was reversed. The market design in ERCOT provides ample, if not excessive, financial incentives for generators to be available during periods of system stress. And we've seen the benefits of that in summer after summer during Texas's brutal summer peak seasons. What was lacking for market participants was sufficient information about the chances that an event like this would happen, a weather event like this would happen, and what the consequences were likely to be up and down the value chain in the Texas power system. And so while market participants had ample financial incentive to make prudent preparations for an event like this, they had nowhere near the information they should have had about how to respond to those financial incentives. And that information can really only come from the sort of the system operator or the regulator, the sorts of market authorities that have to be responsible for those sorts of things. Next, please. There's been a lot of talk about the fact that ERCOT is not synchronized with or strongly interconnected with neighboring markets, and that is true. That was really not a major factor here, as already mentioned, because of the very widespread nature of this storm. Being connected to SPP, being connected to Entergy, being connected to the Western Interconnect really wouldn't have been of tremendous help because they were battling the situation on their own and didn't have much to share with Texas. That said, it's still the case that more regional integration would still be very beneficial. And in fact, last week, Texas, and specifically Texas, faced another event, which fortunately did not end up leading to service interruptions, which was the combination of extremely hot weather, which was affecting the entire Western North America, but also the fact that for reasons that are still being worked out, as much as 3 times the amount of thermal generation that would normally be expected to be on planned and forced outage at this time of the year, up to 3 times as much was actually on outage, almost all of that on forced outage, and most of that coming from 4 large plants. That ERCOT was able to manage through that situation, which is kudos to ERCOT. But had the ERCOT system been more tightly interconnected with or synchronized with neighboring systems, that situation would have been more of a footnote. And in fact, those things happen. I mean, the fact that Belgium lost half of its nuclear fleet virtually overnight due to a common mode failure a number of years ago shows that these sorts of things happen. Not very often, but they do happen. And the fact that Belgium was synchronized with and more strongly interconnected with the Northwest European region, they were able to manage through that. So ERCOT's isolation was not a factor here, but it is something that could be addressed. Next, please. So where did it all go wrong? Well, put simply, one factor was that it was winter. The ERCOT system, the Texas power system, has not just since liberalization, but has for 100 years been exquisitely tuned to deliver reliable service during Texas's brutal summer peak demand events. And despite the fact that we know that that every 25 or 30 years, or let's say every 10 or 15 years, if you want to include the February 2011 event, we know that there will occasionally be severe winter weather in Texas. It is still not the case that it is still the case that the arrangements, market arrangements, physical arrangements, the way that power plants are built in Texas, they're all built outdoors, are simply not designed to account to optimize or to maximize performance under winter conditions. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Next, please. There is no parallel reliability regime in the natural gas industry, and more specifically in the Texas natural gas industry, parallel to the to what is generally considered a very sort of strict reliability regime in the power sector. When you combine that with the fact that in Texas there's a very, very weak regulatory infrastructure over the fossil gas industry, we ended up having, under these conditions, a foreseeable gas supply failure. And there's still the possibility that there was market manipulation by gas producers. Next, please. There were critical gas infrastructure facilities like the electric drive compressor stations and heating facilities at gas processing plants that had not been identified as critical electrical loads. And the party primarily responsible for doing that is the gas industry. And as a result, when these mandatory load curtailment orders were issued by ERCOT and carried out by local distribution companies, some of these critical facilities were actually curtailed, which compounded the problem. Next, please. As in the 2014 polar vortex and PJM's capacity market, the mechanisms that are in place to pay for reserves were compromised by undue reliance on vulnerable thermal generation. Next, please. On the demand side, there's been a very sustained boom in building of new residential buildings in Texas. Since 2010, there have been more new residential facilities built in Texas than in the next two states combined, California and Florida. Combine that with the fact that the reliance on electric resistance heating has become more and more widespread. Something like 67% of all residential buildings in Texas rely on electric resistance heating, and you add in the rare but predictable storm, you end up with a foreseeable winter load bomb, as I refer to it, that unfortunately no one seems to have foreseen. Next, please. This is an issue that's been covered by some of the more perceptive experts, including Alison Silverstein, that the process of protecting critical loads takes place in Texas on what are unusually large and undifferentiated circuits. And as a result, there were wide swaths of load that should have been available to participate in rolling curtailments that were off limits because they were behind these protected critical loads. So what could have been a less severe event, maybe not curtailing 30% of load for 3 days, but having rolling curtailments of, let's say, 5% of load for 2 or 3 hours at a time, that was not an option. It's referred to by some as sectionalization of circuits. And so this turned a bad situation into a catastrophic situation. Next. Texas has one of the lowest performing building efficiency standards in the country. And so when you combine very inefficient electric resistance heating with poor building efficiency, you have a disaster in waiting. So a building sector that could have, and in some regions of the US would have remained habitable for 2 to 3 days, became uninhabitable within hours. And this is a situation that needs to be addressed for all sorts of reasons, including addressing summer peaks. Next, please. And finally, and this is a more complicated topic, and I'm not sure we need to get into it here, but there's the issue of pricing circuit breakers. The sustained maximum scarcity pricing that occurred from Monday morning right on through to Friday morning was by most accounts overdone. It was excessive. The maximum scarcity pricing probably should have been interrupted with a circuit breaker sometime on Wednesday. But the circuit breaker that was in place in the ERCOT market, and there was a circuit breaker, going back to the first point, this was a winter event. That circuit breaker is designed around summer conditions and specifically summer gas market conditions. And so something that should have alleviated the pain for consumers failed to work. And so much of the pain. So scarcity pricing is obviously intended to drive responses both on the demand side and on the supply side to ensure that that all supply that can function does function. And it's also intended to provide the longer term investment signals. But once you reach a certain point in terms of cumulative impact of scarcity pricing, it's really not doing much of anything beyond that. It's provided all of the signals it can provide. It's provided all of the incentives it can provide in terms of investment, after which it's just simply creating pain, unnecessarily and pointless pain. And that is something that's going to have to be addressed as well. And finally, next slide, last slide. If you want a really, really good report that sheds most of the nonsense that's been talked about around this, there was a report published on June 3rd by 6 former Texas regulatory officials, all of whom have been involved in one capacity or another in the evolution of the Texas power system over the past 25 years. It's available here. It's an excellent report on what happened, what needs to be done to make sure it never happens again. So I'll leave it there, and we'll take the rest of the time for questions.